James, can you hear me okay? James McPherson, said by some to be the dean of Civil War historians, said, and I quote, that 90, perhaps 95% of serious historians believe the war was about slavery, end quote. And he's former president of the American Historical Association. So that's a pretty powerful authority. He's wrong, of course, but that shows you how deep that era goes. Today I want to talk about this view he has, what I call the official view, that the South seceded for the reprehensible reason of enslaving human beings. That was this reason. And the North, who had it with slavery, invaded and freed the slaves. That's a wonderful, morally warming story. And so it's one reason it's easy to buy it. But it's not true. Slavery was, and I cannot overstress this, was a national wrong. It was not a wrong peculiar to the South. It was wrong, but it wasn't peculiar to the South. Consider the following. The North drew nourishment from slavery at every point in its over 2-century-long career. Massachusetts in 1641 was the first colony to legalize the slave trade. Over a period of 170 years, New England states made hundreds of voyages to Africa. James DeWolf of Rhode Island made over 80 voyages. It's a lot of slave trading. As of 1860, the wealth of the Northeast originated mainly from the slave trade and in servicing slave economies in the Western Hemisphere. The Industrial Revolution began with the New England textile manufacturing, which had an insatiable demand for cotton all over the world. Slave property in 1860 was the largest single investment in America, amounting to a value of over $3 billion in 1860 money. That was 3 times the value of all the railroads and factories put together in the North. And a substantial percentage of every dollar of that over $3 billion represented Northern profits. Slavery, therefore, was a national wrong, and it demanded a national solution. And this had 2 pillars. One, compensation to the planters for the loss of that $3 billion, and integration of the freedmen into American society. That would have been the morally right thing to do, certainly from our perspective. And historians today are quite accustomed to using our perspective, moral perspective. Yet as of 1860, no national plan of compensated emancipation and integration was put forth by any political party. Princeton economist Patricia Golden, seeking to discover whether emancipation would have cost more than the war, was, quote, surprised, end quote, to discover that the antebellum Congress, there was no record in it of any proposal for national emancipation. She concluded, therefore, that the war could not have been about slavery. Although Congress stood mute on compensated emancipation, it resolutely opposed integrating blacks into Northern society. In a debate with Stephen Douglas, August 21st, 1858, Lincoln explained why there was no national support for emancipation. None. He said, quote, "What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? That is, without citizenship and civil rights? Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? What next? Free them? and keep them free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My feelings will not admit of this, and if mine did, we well know that the great mass of American white people will not. We cannot then make them equals, end quote. We cannot make them equals. Lincoln confessed, he didn't like that conclusion, but he confessed, quote, "If all earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution," end quote. And that is where the Northern mind stood in 1861. But a year into the war, fearing he might lose it, Lincoln did propose a nationally funded plan of compensated emancipation to entice the border states to support the Union, but he was careful to exclude integration. To the objection that his plan would lead to a swarm of free blacks moving north, he replied, quote, "Cannot the North decide for itself whether to receive them?" End quote. The states had the authority to do that. So don't worry, they're not coming north. You can stop it. When Northerners thought about slavery, therefore, it was not how to free and integrate Africans into America. It was how to free themselves from the presence of the black man. To this end, the North pursued 4 distinct, interrelated policies, which I shall take in turn. 4. The first policy was colonization, sending blacks to what Lincoln called, quote, "their native land," or some other place suitable. This would solve Lincoln's dilemma that emancipation in America, either with or without civil rights, was impossible. Colonization would enable the freedmen to enjoy their God-given natural rights in a land of their own. And it would free America from what Lincoln, following Henry Clay, called, quote, "the troublesome presence of free Negroes," end quote. A successful community was established in Liberia and exists today. But elsewhere, colonization was a failure, and that meant that the African was here to stay, all 4 million. And this leads to the second policy, which I shall call state territorial segregation. The antebellum states had authority over immigration into their territory. So states of the Midwest and West passed either constitutional prohibitions or legislative statutes against free blacks entering the states. Historian Eugene Bergwanger estimates that over 79% of the people of Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, and Kansas voted to exclude the free Negro simply from their prejudice, end quote. The Chicago Times acknowledged that, quote, "there is in the great mass of the people a natural and proper loathing of the Negro, which forbids contact with him as with a leper," end quote. Indiana and Ohio passed policies to colonize a certain number of free blacks to Africa on a regular basis until all were removed from the states. Lincoln's state of Illinois in 1853 tightened its 1833 constitutional prohibition for blacks entering to rule that any free black that stayed longer than 10 days could be arrested and sold to labor for a year. Lincoln did not raise his voice against these black codes. The third policy I shall call continental segregation. It sought to use not state but federal power to keep slaves out of the vast western territories acquired from the Mexican War. It is typically called the, quote, Wilmot Proviso, after Congressman David Wilmot, who proposed it. It is often assumed, and I did as a student, that this was a noble effort to abolish slavery. Keep the slaves out of the West. Don't stain the territory with the evil. But it was in fact a move to keep blacks out of the West. Wilmot himself explained, quote, "I plead the cause and the rights of white free men, and I would preserve to free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance. I want to have nothing to do with the free Negro or the slave Negro. We wish to settle the territory with free white people," end quote. Although the proviso failed in Congress, its goal reappeared in the newly formed Republican Party, 1854. Historian Robert Durden observes that the Republican Party's policy was, quote, "that all unoccupied territories of the United States, and such as they may hereafter acquire," notice that they may hereafter acquire, "shall be reserved for the white Caucasian race, a thing that cannot be except by the exclusion of slavery." If you have slavery, they can be freed, and so we have to nip it in the bud, end quote. A Republican newspaper declared that the point of the Republican Party was to free the West from, quote, "the pestilential presence of the black man," end quote. And Lincoln said to this, quote, "What I would most desire is a separation of the white and black races," end quote. And he meant separation on a continental scale. Slavery, he said, could be accepted by the North for 100 years, quote, 100 years, if it were contained to the South. It is important to understand that the antebellum North did not use terms such as anti-slavery and republicanism with the egalitarian moral connotations entailed in our usage today. It's very important. I know when I read these terms, I interpreted them in 20th century terms, but that was a mistake. And it's hard to get your mind around this. Anti-slavery often meant simply anti-black. And free states were ones free of Negroes. Illinois' Lincoln was a free state. But, was a free state, but its constitution prevented free blacks from settling. An abolitionist had this to say about his fellow Midwesterners who supported this no slavery in the West business. Quote, "They are more properly Negro haters who vote free state to keep Negroes out, free or slave. One half of them would go for slavery if Negroes were to be allowed here at all. The inherent sinfulness of slavery is not once thought of by them," end quote. This twisted inversion of moral language was called out and condemned by H. Ford Douglass, a free Negro in Illinois, where free blacks were not citizens of the state and did not enjoy basic civil rights. Douglass bitterly declaimed that if he dared to send his children to Illinois schools, quote, "Abraham Lincoln would kick them out in the name of republicanism and anti-slavery," end quote. You see the inversion? Get your mind around that next time you hear about anti-slavery or abolition. This desire to keep the Midwest and West an African-free zone was held by the great majority in the North and at the highest cultural and political intellectual level. And I'll give evidence for that later. For example, William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, confessed that, quote, "the motive of those, like himself, who protested against the extension of slavery had always really been concern for the welfare of the white man and not an unnatural sympathy for the Negro," end quote. An unnatural sympathy for the Negro. And Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, declared, quote, "It is not the slave I love, but his master that I hate." pretty much for the reasons that Tom DiLorenzo has talked about. Don't get caught up in some belief that Chase was morally outraged about the institution itself, as we might be. Charles Eliot Norton, a learned Boston abolitionist, supported confining blacks to the South at all costs. It was a question, he said, of whether, quote, a century hence America would be occupied by a civilized or barbarous race, end quote. Dr. Daniel Drake, a respected scientist, writer, and physician in Cincinnati, declared in the National Registrator, 1851, quote, the free states should not hereafter permit Negroes or their descendants of mixed blood to reside in, pass through, or even visit them. Even visit them. And the slave states should forbid emancipation, except a guarantee be given that the liberated should not seek the free states, end quote. And he advocated, quote, not only to leave all slaves, but all Negroes, those now in the North excepted, to the management of the South. Keep them in the South and let the South manage them. They can't even visit relatives here. Now this is a respected scientist. And the North's invasion of the South and resort to total war created hundreds of thousands of black refugees and raised fears they would go north. Lincoln used the army to keep them bottled up in the South. Shepard Pike, a correspondent for the influential New York Tribune, was an abolitionist, but he did not want to live with Negroes. He wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in February 1861, shortly after secession, we say, quote, we say the free states should say, confine the Negro to the smallest possible area. Hem him in, coop him up, slough him off. Preserve just so much of North America as is possible for the white man, end quote. A New England abolitionist and clergyman, Joseph Henry Allen, writing in a Unitarian journal in April 1862, urged that blacks should be confined to federal reservations in the South. This would also rid the North of blacks, whose racial instincts, it was thought, would drive them naturally to the hot, humid South when slavery was abolished, end quote. Okay, I've discussed three policies to keep the blacks out. I turn now to the final and fourth policy, which I call the extinction thesis. And this is you're going to have to get your mind around this. Extinction. Its goal was to gradually eliminate all blacks from America. Historian George Frederickson observes that, quote, the kind of American nationality for which the North was fighting in the Civil War could be fully achieved only by the removal of the Negro from America, end quote. Now you might think this was a utopian fantasy, but it wasn't. Consider the following. By 1860, the North had managed to keep itself almost completely free of the African presence. For example, the black population in New England, for instance, was a mere 0.8%. And that was mostly in places like Connecticut. You could live your whole life in New England and never see a black person. In the mid-Atlantic states, it was 1.8. In the Midwest, 1.1, and about the same in the West. But in the Upper South, blacks were over 20% of the population. And in the Deep South, over 40%. But how could one seriously imagine the extinction of nearly 4 million people, blacks? The answer was given by Harvard biologist Louis Agassiz, an internationally distinguished figure. He argued that blacks were of a different species from whites. roughly in the way in which chimpanzees are from humans. This means their inferiority was systematic. It could not be improved. There's only so much you can do with a chimpanzee. What had kept the black population increasing on par with whites, which the North was really upset about, was the artificial cradle-to-grave welfare system of the planters. If you ended slavery, they would die out. They couldn't compete. Nor was this a fantasy, because in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that blacks were not citizens as understood by the Constitution. Since they were not citizens, they could not go west. Even if they were free, they couldn't go west. They had no right to go west. And they couldn't go to the states. States kept them out. Emancipation would mean their extinction, because they would no longer have the protection of federal or state law. The extinction thesis was not a fringe idea. Please get that in your mind. It was mainstream all the way up to the top. I'll just give you some examples. Jefferson Davis was shocked, arriving in Washington as a junior senator, to hear the extinction of blacks talked about as a matter of course. As an example, consider the official report of the Republican-controlled House Committee on Emancipation in 1862. It stated in its annual report, quote, "The highest interests of the white race, whether Anglo-Saxon, Celt, or Scandinavian, requires that the whole country should be held and occupied by these races alone. For the Anglo-American looks upon every acre of our present domain as intended for him and not for the Negro," end quote. William Seward, Lincoln Secretary of State, said, quote, "The white man needs the continent later upon, he must and will have it," end quote. In 1860, he described blacks as a, quote, "foreign, feeble element, a pitiful exotic plant unnecessarily put in our field, and which is unprofitable to cultivate," end quote. They just sort of got marooned here somehow. And we can't cultivate. If you don't cultivate a plant, what happens? It dies. Extinction. George Weston, a distinguished economist and abolitionist, wrote in 1857, quote, "When the white artisans and farmers want the room which the African occupies, they will take it, not by rude force, but by gentle and gradual and peaceful processes," end quote. He denounced the artificial cradle-to-grave welfare system of the plantation, which kept the black population growth comparable to whites. He condemned it, quote, "no scheme of nature, but a violation of all natural, moral, and moral laws." A violation of moral laws, because they should be free to disappear. Horace Bushnell was one of the North's distinguished theologians. This is at the very top. He also believed that emancipation meant the gradual extinction of blacks. Nor did this bother him. And he says, quote, "And indeed, since we must all die, why should it grieve us that a stock thousands of years behind and the scale of culture should die with few and still fewer children to succeed, till finally the whole succession remains in the more cultivated race," end quote. If there was a super abolitionist, the iconic symbol, it would be Theodore Parker of Massachusetts, a charismatic minister and a member of the Secret Six that supported and funded John Brown's abortive raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. He wrote a pamphlet arguing that slaves had a moral right to assassinate their masters. And he helped fund a plan to start a slave uprising. Here's what he says, though. He believed in extinction. Quote, "When slavery is abolished, the African population will decline in the United States and die out of the South. It will die out of the South, as out of Northampton and Lexington, Massachusetts, end quote. Now think about that. Who in the South could have imagined blacks dying out? It was unthinkable. First of all, they thought the South was their home, not Africa, at least by 1860. Parker thought there were inferior races that could be improved. One of these was the Irish. And he says, but not the African, quote, "For 2 generations, what a change there will be in the condition of the Irish living in New England. But in 20 generations, the Negroes will stand just where they are now, if they have not disappeared. There will be no improvement. You can do just so much with a chimpanzee. You might want to do more, but you can't." This is Theodore Parker, abolitionist of abolitionists. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe was a respected physician, wealthy philanthropist who bankrolled John Brown's terrorist raid at Harper's Ferry. He was a friend of Parker who also helped. Nevertheless, Lincoln appointed him to the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission to propose future policy for the freedmen. He should have been put in jail for treason, but anyway. Although Howe believed blacks had natural rights and should be free, notice what you can do with natural rights. You can have a lot of fun with natural rights. Don't get too excited about natural rights. Lincoln, although Howe believed they had natural rights, he also thought the abolition of slavery with its artificial and unnatural welfare system would, quote, "allow fair play to natural laws, by the operation of which it seems to me the colored population will disappear from the northern and middle states, if not from the continent, before the more vigorous and prolific race," end quote. And he urged Lincoln to adopt federal policies that allowed this fair play to those natural laws. That was his recommendation. Finally, the great Yankee moralist Ralph Waldo Emerson said that after emancipation, blacks would die out. He says, they will be destined, quote, destined for museums. They will only be destined for museums like the dodo, end quote. Actually, California has museums with Anglos in them who are disappearing like the dodo. But anyway, the above study demonstrates that the antebellum North utterly failed to do the morally right thing about slavery, namely put forth a national program of compensated emancipation and integration. But what they demanded was immediate, well, I won't go into that. All right. The only thing that they put forth was, the abolitionists put forth, was immediate and uncompensated emancipation. I mean, that's a non-starter, right? You get rid of the $3 billion immediately and with no compensation. That was the New England abolitionism. So the leader was William Lloyd Garrison, founded this movement in about 1831. And he could not bring himself to support the British bill for emancipation in the Caribbean. That's seen as a landmark achievement in 1834 that freed slavery in the West Indies, because it included compensation and a 5-year apprenticeship period. So Garrison said, no, it's got to be immediate and uncompensated. Can't support it. But what about the war? What about after the war? Don't the Reconstruction Amendments present a North seeking, if belatedly, to do the morally right thing about slavery? This is how it's presented. And emancipation? The short answer is partly yes, but mostly no. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But we need to remember that the extinction thesis required the abolition of slavery in the South. You understand? So that's not a great moral advance for these people. When Alexander Stephens asked Lincoln, what are you going to do with these hundreds of thousands of people displaced from the care of the plantation? Lincoln said, brought up one of his little down-home stories and said, let them root hog or die. Well, they died by the tens of thousands, as we'll see. The 14th Amendment did provide basic civil rights for blacks and enable them to move across the United States as citizens of the United States and citizens of the state in which they resided. But notice how this amendment was passed. It was presented to the states. Southern states voted against it, and enough northern states voted against it so that it failed. So the 14th Amendment failed. So what did the Republicans do? The southern states were used in ratifying the 13th Amendment. In other words, if they hadn't voted for the 13th Amendment, it might not have passed. So they were necessary for its passing. So they were in good standing in that respect. But they wouldn't vote for this 14th Amendment. So what the radical Republicans says, well, we'll just kick them out of the United States. So they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which declared that 10 southern states, except for Tennessee, and I won't go into that, but 10 southern states were non-states. Their representatives were taken out of Washington, and they were put under military rule. They were dictatorships. And they were told, you can be back in the Union and get out of military rule if you vote for this 14th Amendment, which we're going to float again. And they resisted. The courts wouldn't do anything for them. And so they submitted to it, and they voted with it. One Confederate called that the oath of allegiance that had to be taken after the war, swallowing the dog. So they swallowed the dog and voted for the 14th Amendment. And that's the only way it passed. But it didn't pass because you cannot amend the Constitution with 10 non-states. You have to have representatives in Washington, in the Senate, in the Congress. So it was never constitutionally ratified. But never mind, Congress said it was. So there we have it. By the way, Mississippi, years, I think 1970 or something, ratified it. So every once in a while, a state will, I guess they've all ratified it by now. But it's important to understand the chicanery behind even our Constitution. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. This was something Northerners were absolutely opposed to. In the North in 1860, only 4 states allowed blacks to vote, and they were in New England, and there were no blacks in New England to speak of. And in the state where there were some blacks in New England, Connecticut, they voted after the war in 1866 to prohibit blacks from voting in that New England state, and so did Minnesota, and so does Wisconsin. So that was the opinion of Northerners after the war. Immediately they said, well, we got not all these blacks, but a few blacks here, so they can't vote. We can't let them vote. So how are they going to pass the 15th Amendment with that attitude? There are 2 winning arguments. One was the Republican argument that if we don't give the blacks the right to vote, the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats will unite, because Lincoln got only 39% of the vote. 60% of Americans voted against the Republican Party. It was doomed with the reunion. But if we could get the blacks to vote in the South, and there are no blacks in the North, we don't have to worry about that, then we could control, the Republican Party could control. And it did until the population of the North got big enough that it didn't have to do that. The other argument was that if blacks could vote in the South, they would leave the North. This is argued over and over again. They would leave the North because racially race theory was very important, and racially their instincts required the hot, humid regions. They wanted to get out of Wisconsin, it's cold, out of Michigan, to get back in the jungle, where people felt warm and comfortable. I like the jungle myself. I was born in South Carolina without air conditioning. I think it's ruined the South, but we won't go into that. Anyway, when you buy into air conditioning, be sure you read the fine print under the thing. There's other things that go along with that. Okay. Let's go back now to the twin pillars of a just emancipation, compensated emancipation, integration. The North failed at compensation, utterly failed. Over $3 billion in slave property was wiped out, and that was worth, as I said, 3 times the value of all the railroads and factories in the North in 1860. And what about integration? The 14th Amendment did allow integration, legal integration. You're a black citizen, you're a citizen now, states, you can move anywhere you want to. But that's not enough. Political rules were also rigged against material conditions of integration. You don't just need legal integration, you need the material conditions for it, and that's a political question. So the political rules were still rigged against these material conditions. Blacks were still confined to the South. Remember, Lincoln used the military to keep them in initially. As of 1900, only 8% of blacks lived outside the region. How did that happen? Well, having confiscated most of what historian Thomas Fleming called the South's, quote, breathtaking wealth, the South was very wealthy. Having destroyed its currency, repudiated its public debt, the South had little means to do what was necessary for the freedmen. Remember, they grew up, these planters grew up with a legal and moral obligation of oblige. They had an obligation to care for these people, and they did. They cared for them so well that in 1800, there were about a little over a million slaves in America, 1800. If they had been treated like the British treated their slaves in the Caribbean, there would have been in 1800 not a million, but 187,000. They died in tremendous numbers in the Caribbean. And New Englanders were involved in that system. So the Southerners took good care of the freedmen, physically. What did the Northerners then, having destroyed the Union and destroyed the wealth that the South could have used for the transition to emancipation, had an obligation to do at least as well for the freedmen as the planters had done, at least that. In addition, they had an obligation to educate these people for entrance into the American political and social order. What did they do? Virtually nothing. The agency responsible for this was the Freedmen's Bureau. It lasted 7 years. But it received only $28 million. In contrast, the Union paid $1 million a month for forage for horses during the war. $1 million a month for forage for horses. Had the war lasted as long as the Freedmen's Bureau, 7 years, the Union would have spent $84 million on forage, 3 times as much as it spent on the Freedmen's Bureau. That is the measure of concern the Union exhibited for the freedmen. Remember Seward's point about no unnatural sympathy for the blacks? No unnatural sympathy? To this we should add historian Ludwell Johnson's observation that the Freedmen's Bureau provided relief and education to no more than 0.5% of the freedmen. And you've heard some inflated remarks about the Freedmen's Bureau. When requests were made for more support, the response was that the welfare of the freedmen, now get this, was the duty of the states, not the federal government. But that was an excuse. The federal government's power had been stretched to build the largest military force in the world prior to World War I. It had kicked 10 states out of the Union. But when it came to the great sums of money needed to give the freedmen a fresh start, it was stopped dead in its tracks by states' rights. The Emancipation Proclamation was not motivated to achieve humanitarian goals. It was a military measure, and this is not a cynical remark. It was in fact a military measure to encourage a slave uprising or otherwise disrupt the ability of the South to resist conquest. No provision was made beforehand to provide for the hundreds of thousands of slaves that would be uprooted from the care of the plantation. And they died by the tens of thousands. The administration responded by hastily throwing up what would be the first modern concentration camps. That honor is usually given to the British during the Boer War in 1889. The camps were to be funded by marching. Now here's how they would be financed. We're not going to get any federal grants. They would be funded by marching able-bodied males away from the camps to work for money, and that would be used to feed and clothe the women, children, and aged. This was to teach the freedmen the principles of free market capitalism. But the problem is the war-torn South, in that region, there was little work. And some of the freedmen's earnings were confiscated by officers that had northern opinions about blacks. The result was malnourishment, steady malnourishment, as well as disease from the fetid conditions of the camps themselves. Epidemics broke out that ravaged the region. The most devastating was a smallpox epidemic that raged into the Reconstruction period. Historian Jim Downs, in a book a few years ago, observes that, quote, many in Congress, particularly in 1865, believed that freed slaves were meant to go extinct. So he understands this. Few historians mention it, as far as I can see. They did not, and he continues, they did not allocate money toward government programs, to provide them with medical attention, end quote. Sorry about that. The standard procedures of vaccination, well established in the North for smallpox, were not regularly applied to blacks, who died in greater numbers in proportion to whites. Children could die within a day of exhibiting symptoms. A look at several camps reveals a mortality rate of around 25%. Now, if 800,000 is the total number in the camps, that's one estimate, 800,000, and if the mortality rate was 25, might not have been, but that's a reasonable supposition for the moment, if it was 25%, the mortality of the whole could be as high as 200,000. Many viewed this unbalanced black mortality as an innate weakness to resist disease as evidence supporting the extinction thesis. What do you expect? There were 260,000 free blacks in the South, 260 free blacks. When Southerners emancipated slaves, they had to prove that those emancipated could care for themselves. Otherwise, they had to care for them. The Emancipation Proclamation contained no such requirement. Instead, it used the displaced freedmen as necessities of war and their deaths as collateral damage. But having destroyed and impoverished the South, the North had an obligation to care for them as well as the planters. But few voices even raised this issue. One was Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky in April 1864. He proposed adding to the Abolition Amendment a measure to distribute newly freed blacks to all the states in proportion to their white population. The Senate firmly rejected the proposal. Waitman T. Wiley, a Republican from West Virginia, proposed an amendment to the Freedmen's Bureau to find land in the North for free blacks, which would solve the labor problem and provide Yankee models of character for emulation, since the South just taught them how to be barbarous. But arch abolitionists, such as New England's Charles Sumner, another icon of abolition, said bringing free blacks to the North would, quote, have a bad effect on New England, end quote. A Methodist preacher in Minnesota was willing to allow 10,000 black guest workers to enter the state for a year as long as they were carefully guarded and punished if they remained beyond the contract. Secretary of the Interior John P. Usher, I'm getting to the end now, John P. Usher proposed in his annual report to the president that freed blacks could be sent to the West to work on the railroad. Lincoln rejected the proposal. The great emancipator. Okay, to sum up here. Historian Jack Vogeley, who has studied Northern racial policy, observes, quote, although the freedmen's labor was badly needed in the North and free land and opportunity awaited them in the West, Northern Republicans, Democrats, and many abolitionists alike closed ranks to keep free blacks out of the West and North. He continues, quote, this may well have been one of the most tragic failures of Civil War statesmanship, particularly the discarded alternative of voluntary resettlement in the West. Perhaps never in American history has the federal government had a better opportunity both to mitigate racial intolerance and to emancipate the freedmen from the heritage of slavery than of transporting those who are willing to go into the West, the vast, thinly settled Western territories, end quote. But see, this never was the policy. This was not a failure. This was never the policy of the North. It was, in conclusion, to the question, how did the North respond to the national enormity of slavery? The answer must be that it made no morally significant response at all. It didn't make a weak response, no response that was morally interesting, because it disowned the obligation. I mean, if you don't have the obligation, you don't have to respond to it. What about the abolitionists? This tiny but vocal sect did demand a national emancipation, but it was spoiled by insisting that emancipation be immediate and uncompensated. Immediate emancipation of nearly 4 million blacks in America, where free blacks did not have civil rights and were largely excluded from the North and West, could lead to extinction, as many Northerners thought and many hoped. To prevent this, the expensive programs of education and resettlement would be needed, and it was only just that the North should pay its share of the cost of these programs because of its responsibility for the origin and continuation of slavery, not to mention the war itself. Okay, I'll just end there because we're shut for time, but you can see how the North responded to slavery is really quite different from how we've been taught. Thank you.